Welcome to Crying Inside. This is where we share emotional family stories, tragedies that bring tears but also leave deep lessons. Thank you for taking the time to follow our channel and support us. If this is your first visit, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any stories. Every subscribe and share from you motivates us to keep creating meaningful videos. Sometimes family isn't where you're protected, but where you're cast aside. But justice may come late. It never disappear. There are those who once thought they would be forgotten forever, pushed to the margins in their own home. Yet the truth can be revealed in the most unexpected way, and that moment can change a fate. Today's story is about a girl who seemed to have lost everything. For many years, she endured her stepmother's disdain, living in pain from being abandoned by her father. When her father passed away, everyone thought she would walk away empty-handed, leaving the entire fortune worth $154 million to her stepmother and half-siblings. But at the most tense moment, a single smile from the lawyer turned everything around and took the story in an unexpected direction. The conference room of the law office was inside an old red brick building in downtown Portland. Winter morning light filtered through the frosted window, casting a cold, pale yellow glow over the long wooden table. The air was thick and silent, so quiet Julia could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. She sat at one end of the table, hands resting on her knees, trembling slightly, though trying to hide it. The simple black dress she chose this morning seemed too plain compared to the elegance of the woman sitting across from her. Evelyn, her stepmother, still carried the poise. Julia remembered her hair carefully styled, an expensive dress hugging her figure, a sparkling white pearl necklace around her neck. Evelyn's eyes were fixed on Julia, not with the look of family, but like a victor waiting for her prey to fail. "You won't get a dime from your father's $154 million, Will," Evelyn said, her words falling like a cold blade. She smiled, a smile that didn't hide her arrogance at all. Julia took a deep breath, trying to keep her face from showing any emotion. In that moment, she briefly thought about the little Lavender Bloom café in Denver, which she had built up with sweat and tears over the years. A tiny café with 10 old tables and chairs, the smell of roasted coffee blended with dried lavender in every corner. There, she was herself, the owner, the survivor of past wounds. But here, in this strange room, she was just the daughter, pushed to the sidelines within her own family. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs, fingers playing with a diamond ring as big as a pea. Her eyes glanced over Julia, as if a snap of her fingers could erase her existence. Next to Evelyn were her 2 children from another marriage, Chloe and Ryan, dressed neatly, looking arrogant. They didn't even look at Julia, just laughed among themselves as if certain of their victory. Julia felt her blood rush to her face, her heart pounding in her chest. She once thought that after all these years, through countless insults and indifference, she had grown used to Evelyn's contempt. But today, in front of the lawyer, at the moment her father's entire estate would be decided, every word from Evelyn cut into Julia's heart like salt on an unhealed wound. "I thought I had grown used to that contempt," Julia thought silently, "but today, my fate will be decided." She closed her eyes for a second, memories flooding back. The image of her father, Thomas Bennett, in an old flannel shirt, bustling about making pancakes for his daughter every Sunday morning. The soft guitar playing of her mother, Laura, a gentle woman with hands that smelled of lavender. Summer evenings sitting on the porch in Austin, Texas. Father and daughter watching fireworks light up the sky. Then the memories shattered. The sound of sirens, screeching brakes, her mother's hand falling limp on the cold pavement. Julia was only 10 years old then, her eyes red as she watched the coffin being lowered into the ground. From that day on, her world fractured. Her father grew distant. Then another woman appeared, bringing with her strong perfume scents and cold words. Evelyn's voice pulls Julia back to the present. "Don't expect any miracles. You mean nothing to him anymore. Everything belongs to this family, and you're not a part of it." Julia clenched her hand tightly under the table. Outside, the drizzle fell softly, raindrops clinging to the window pane forming long streaks, like tears held back. In that moment she realized she wasn't just sitting in a lawyer's office. She was standing on the line between the past and the future. On one side was the bitter truth that she would continue to be cast aside. On the other, a faint hope that her father had left something behind. Julia's hand trembled slightly, but the voice inside her was clear. I won't give up. If today is the day of reckoning, I will face it, no matter the outcome. Lawyer Howard stepped in, holding a thick stack of files. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Evelyn held her head high, still smiling confidently, as if her fate was already sealed. Julia sat up straight, eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't know what was coming, only that from this moment on, her life would never be the same. Julia Bennett was born in Austin, Texas, on a spring morning when the oak trees around the neighborhood were just budding. She was the only child of Thomas Bennett and Laura. Their small white house sat in a peaceful suburb where families often opened windows to catch the breeze, kids played outside, and neighbors dropped by with warm homemade apple pies. Julia's childhood was simple, but filled with laughter. Every weekend morning, the smell of fresh pancakes always filled the kitchen. Her tall father, Thomas, usually wore an old red flannel shirt, spatula in hand, laughing heartily as batter splattered out of the pan. Her mother, Laura, often sat by the window, soft brown hair swept to the side, skillfully strumming gentle melodies on a worn wooden guitar. When she sang, the whole house seemed bathed in a soft, warm light. Laura was a gentle, patient woman who radiated a warmth that made everyone feel welcome. In the backyard garden, she grew a patch of lavender. Every day, Julia often helped her mom water the plants, her small hands gently cradling the deep purple flower branches. She loved that sweet, peaceful scent so much that she always tucked a small sprig into her workbook, so whenever she opened it, the lavender fragrance would still linger. Thomas, Julia's father, was a determined businessman. He owned a mid-sized construction company in Texas. Work kept him busy, but for Julia, he never lacked time. On summer evenings, he often took her for rides in his old pickup truck, stopping by the roadside ice cream shop, and together they'd sit on the hood watching fireworks during festivals. To Julia, her dad was not just a strong pillar, but also a friend, a storyteller, and a hero who never faltered. Everything changed when Julia turned 10. It was a fall afternoon, the Austin sky clear, with the wind carrying the scent of dry leaves and damp earth. Her dad was away on a business trip, so her mom came to pick her up from school. On the way home, Laura promised to stop by their favorite shop to buy 2 cups of hot chocolate. Julia sat in the passenger seat, clutching her backpack tightly, her heart fluttering with that little joy. They stopped at a quiet intersection. The light turned green, and her mom's car slowly rolled forward. In that moment, a delivery truck sped through the intersection, ignoring the red light. Julia heard the screech of brakes, the crash of metal, and then her world flipped upside down. Her body slammed against the car door, her head dizzy, her mom's faint scream echoing before silence fell. When Julia opened her eyes, she was lying on the cold pavement, her leg aching sharply, her ears ringing. Next to her, her mother's hand still held hers, but it was limp and powerless. Laura's eyes were closed, her face pale, blood staining the purple floral dress she had smiled in just that morning. Julia called her mother's name in desperation. People say the little girl kept crying out, her voice hoarse, until the ambulance took them away. But it was all too late. Laura passed away before reaching the hospital. Her mother's funeral was held on a gray, rainy day. Julia stood close to her father, eyes swollen, her small hand gripping the edge of his shirt tightly. Thomas, once so strong, now lowered his head, his shoulders trembling with every breath. He tried to hold back, but his bloodshot eyes couldn't hide the pain. From that day on, Julia understood that an important part of her life was gone forever. The time that followed was filled with exhaustion. Julia lived with the uncertainty of loss. Her father tried to be a pillar of support, but he was also drowning in his own grief. He threw himself into work, staying late at the office, taking on new projects, expanding the company, as if keeping busy would stop him from facing the emptiness inside. On quiet nights in their small house, Julia sat alone doing her homework, only hearing the ticking of the wall clock. Sometimes, father and daughter still sat across from each other at dinner, with only 2 plates on the wide table. They didn't say much, but sometimes Thomas reached out to hold his daughter's hand. That handhold was shaky strong yet powerless. Julia knew her father was trying, but the void left by her mother was too vast. On weekends, the two still went to the cemetery to lay lavender flowers on her mother's grave. Julia watched her father bow his head for a long time, his lips quietly whispering Laura's name. In his eyes, she saw emptiness and weariness. Julia knew how much her father loved her mother and that he would never truly escape that loss. Julia's childhood, after the accident, was no longer a vibrant picture. It was covered in a gray shade of sadness, a silence that stretched through the once warm house. And it was in that darkness that Julia learned to be strong, learning to find comfort in the sprigs of lavender left in the garden. Those small purple flowers became symbols of memory, of her mother's love, and the only thread that kept her connected to a beautiful past. Julia grew up with that vast emptiness inside her, carrying both love and pain. She didn't know that this tragedy was just the beginning of a long, stormy journey, where the arrival of another woman would change everything, pushing her out of the arms that once belonged to her. The 1992nd in Texas was a time when families still held on to close-knit traditions. Every Sunday, the local church was always packed. The people in the small town where the Bennett family lived saw attending church not just as a religious duty, but as an important part of community life. Julia clearly remembers that every Sunday morning, her mother would prepare a simple light blue dress, comb her hair neatly, and her father would pick out his worn gray suit, carefully pressed. They would sit together on a wooden pew, singing hymns and listening to warm, heartfelt sermons. After church, it was usually time for BBQ parties in the backyard. The adults grilled meat over charcoal, filling the air with delicious smoky aroma, while the kids ran and chased each other around the yard. Julia's father, with his open and humorous personality, often stood by the grill, tongs in hand, flipping ribs and telling funny stories that made everyone laugh. Her mother prepared simple salads and lemonade, always gentle and smiling at everyone. Julia often sat on her mother's lap, watching her father busy among the crowd, feeling an unusual sense of comfort. Life back then was simple but warm. Everyone knew each other's names, knew whose kids were in which class, and which families were struggling and ready to help. For Julia, childhood in Texas was a mix of solemn church services, laughter-filled BBQs, and summer nights alive with the sound of crickets. But everything shattered suddenly, after the accident that took her mother away. Since Laura's passing, the atmosphere in the family changed completely. Church services still went on, but Julia and her father showed up less often. Mr. Thomas seemed no longer able to force a smile in front of the crowd, and Julia felt everything was strange without her mother's gentle hand. While her friends enjoyed childhood with games in the front yard, Julia found herself often standing silently in front of the cemetery. Every weekend, her father would take her there. The cemetery sat on a low hill, with rows of maple trees whispering in the wind, the ground always covered with dry leaves. On her mother's grave, Julia and her father placed bunches of purple lavender they picked from the old garden. It was her mother's favorite flower, and the scent was tied to the most beautiful memories of her childhood. Every time they came, Julia's father would stay silent for a long while. He knelt down, his hand resting on the cold tombstone, lips quietly mouthing his wife's name. Julia was still little then, not fully understanding the pain adults feel, but she could feel the trembling in her father's hand when he held hers. Once, when he saw his daughter quietly crying, Thomas held her close, his voice choked but firm. "No matter what happens, you will always be everything to me." Those words stayed deep in Julia's heart, becoming her only support through the dark days. In a world that seemed to be falling apart, she still believed in their father-daughter love. No matter how busy her dad was, no matter how silent the house had become, so quiet, she could hear the wind through the window, Julia held on to that promise. American family culture in Texas, in the 92nd, emphasized connection and sharing. But for Julia, she felt something very different. While other families gathered and enjoyed holidays together, the Bennett household slowly slipped into silence. Her mother's absence left a hole that nothing could fill. BBQ parties lost their laughter, and Sunday mornings no longer had her and her dad sitting in church together. Everything gradually disappeared, replaced by trips to the cemetery and quiet evenings where father and daughter sat in silence. Julia grew up, surrounded by that contrast. On one hand, she carried warm childhood memories, tied to classic American traditions. On the other, she faced the harsh reality that her family was broken, and her faith in a happy home became more fragile than ever. A year after her mother's passing, Julia and her dad's life still hadn't found balance. Thomas Bennett threw himself into work more than ever before. He often left home early in the morning and came back late at night. Family dinners grew scarce, replaced by evenings where Julia sat alone at the long wooden table in the chilly kitchen. Then one day, her father came home with a different look on his face. Julia noticed his smile was brighter, his steps lighter, as if some of the weight in his heart had lifted. That dinner, Thomas looked at his daughter with eyes both hesitant and joyful. He said he had met someone special. Julia was only 11, too young to fully understand what those words meant. But her gut told her that something was about to change forever. A few weeks later, Julia's father took her to a fancy steakhouse in downtown Austin. Sitting at the table was a woman already there. She wore a tight, dark red dress, her shiny brown hair neatly curled, and a small, sparkling diamond necklace around her neck. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. That was the first time Julia met Evelyn. From that very moment, Julia felt the coldness hidden beneath the glamorous facade. Evelyn asked Julia a few questions about school and hobbies, but her tone sounded like a rehearsed script. She laughed louder than necessary at Thomas's mundane stories, occasionally gently touching his arm in a calculated way. Julia sat quietly, feeling like an extra in a play where her father and Evelyn were the main characters. After dinner, on the way home, Julia said nothing. She felt a vague uneasiness inside, but didn't have the words to explain it. All she knew was that Evelyn's presence made her feel like a stranger in her own family. Just a few months later, Thomas announced he was going to marry Evelyn. He told Julia excitedly that this was their chance for a fresh start, to stop the house from being haunted by sadness. Julia sat silently, her heart tightening. She wanted to protest, to shout that no one could replace her mother. But seeing her father's rare, bright smile after all those years of mourning, she didn't have the courage to disappoint him. The wedding happened quickly. Evelyn appeared in a pure white dress, surrounded by friends from real estate and successful business people. Julia stood in a corner, wearing a simple blue dress, feeling out of place among the glamorous crowd. Throughout the ceremony, she felt like she was witnessing the final door closing on her childhood. The father who once belonged just to her and him had now stepped into another world, where Julia was only a faint shadow. Since Evelyn moved in, the Bennett family home changed in every little detail. The family pictures hanging in the hallway, including the one of 8-year-old Julia tightly hugging her mother, disappeared without a trace. Instead, there were expensive abstract paintings in gold frames. The rose-patterned curtains that her mother once hand-sewed were replaced by heavy silk drapes, deep red, as if they absorbed all the light. The familiar scent of lavender was gone, replaced by Evelyn's sharp, overpowering perfume lingering throughout the rooms. Even the living room became a strange place. It used to be where the family sat together, her father telling stories while her mother played the guitar. Now, it had turned into a party hall for Evelyn and her friends' gatherings. Loud laughter, clinking glasses, conversations about real estate, stocks, and yachts echoed through the once peaceful house. Julia was pushed upstairs, where her small room became the only refuge still holding a piece of her mother's memory. Every time she went downstairs, she felt like a guest in her own home. Evelyn looked at her with scrutinizing eyes, half contemptuous, half indifferent. Occasionally, she would make remarks like, "A girl her age, and she doesn't even know how to dress neatly." Thomas's daughter looking so sloppy. Those words were like tiny needles, not painfully sharp right away, but repeated often enough to make Julia feel like she was slowly disappearing. Julia started avoiding being at home. She spent more time in the school library, hanging out at old bookstores, or wandering the streets of Austin to escape the suffocating feeling. In the house that was once a home, she no longer found any warmth. Every step down the hall, every door closing behind her, reminded her that she was no longer welcome. Deep down, Julia understood that her stepmother didn't just want to be her father's new wife. Evelyn wanted to erase all traces of the woman before her, to erase Julia herself as an unwanted memory. And gradually, Julia truly felt like she was being pushed out of her own home. When Evelyn officially became Thomas's wife, she dropped the polite facade she once had. Her coldness was replaced by open contempt toward Julia. At first, it was just small remarks, but they gradually turned into bitter, cutting sarcasm. Every time Julia came home from school wearing her old hoodie or worn-out sneakers, Evelyn would frown and say, "A girl your age should learn to take care of her appearance." "Look at yourself. You look no different than a poor kid," she said, her voice full of criticism. Julia stayed silent, not because she agreed, but because she knew any resistance was pointless. Her father was often away, constantly on business trips to expand the company. Family dinners slowly disappeared, replaced by a fancy dining table, with Evelyn sitting at the center, along with the two young kids, Chloe and Ryan. When Thomas was home, he always tried to keep the peace. But that peace was just for show. He was too tired to face the tensions at home, and in the end, he chose to stay silent. Chloe, her half-sister, was raised by Evelyn from a young age to be her pride and joy. Whenever Julia wore simple clothes, Evelyn would immediately compare. "Look at Chloe, she's only 6, but already knows how to pick pretty dresses and smile sweetly. And you're grown but still sloppy." Those little comparisons, repeated constantly, made Julia feel increasingly like an outsider. She no longer felt like part of the family, but more like a guest, living in a house that used to be hers. Ryan was born 2 years later, making Julia feel even more isolated. Thomas was happy about his son's arrival, and Evelyn had even more reason to push Julia further away. All of her father's attention was focused on the new family. Julia tried many times to get her father's attention, but he seemed exhausted balancing work and his new life. He became passive, letting Evelyn arrange everything in the family. At high school, Julia found no comfort. Her friends talked about family parties, parents going to basketball games with their kids, while Julia never dared to mention her own home. The library became her refuge. Among the towering shelves, she found a bit of peace. The sound of flipping pages replaced the arguments in her head. The smell of old paper replaced the sharp perfume scent that always haunted her at home. Many nights, Julia would sit in her room, watching the light from the living room shining through. Down there, Evelyn was teaching Chloe to play the piano, Ryan was running around, and Dad sat there, smiling wearily. That scene looked like a perfect family. But Julia knew well that in that perfect picture, she had no place. One time, Julia forgot to wash her cup after breakfast. Evelyn came into the kitchen, picked up the cup, and sighed as if it was an unforgivable sin. "Your father works hard for Chloe and Ryan's future," she said, her tone steady but icy cold. "And you're just a shadow of the past." Those words stabbed straight into Julia's heart. She stood still, didn't cry or react, but every word was etched deep in her memory. From that day on, she felt completely rejected. No longer the beloved daughter, but just a reminder of a past Evelyn wanted to erase. Thomas probably heard it. Julia remembered clearly the look in her father's eyes that day, brief sadness and guilt, but then he turned away without saying a word. That silence hurt even more than the scolding. It was like confirmation that Evelyn was right. Julia gradually closed herself off. She avoided her new family, spent more time at school, and took on odd jobs to earn her own spending money. Every time she came home, she quietly went up to her room and closed the door. That room became the only world that still held the warmth of her mother. On her desk, the dried lavender still gave off a gentle scent, reminding Julia of the gentle arms she had lost. Deep down, Julia understood that the conflicts were no longer just small accusations. They had become an invisible barrier, pushing her further away every day. And from there, the seed of distance from her family began to grow, preparing to lead her down a path filled only with loneliness and silent struggles. When Julia turned 18, she knew she couldn't keep living in that house anymore. The house that was once a home had become a strange place, where every wall reminded her she was just an unnecessary shadow. Every step down the hallway was met with Evelyn's scrutinizing gaze. Every meal came with biting comparisons. And whenever she needed her father, Julia only met silence. The day Julia received her acceptance letter to the University of San Francisco, with a half scholarship, felt like a door opening just a crack. It wasn't just an opportunity to study, but a way out. She didn't say much, just packed a few clothes, some treasured books, and a small jar of dried lavender. That morning, as she pulled her old suitcase down the stairs, her father stood in the hallway watching her. He didn't stop her, or ask many questions. He just came over, gave her a brief hug, and whispered, "Take care of yourself. If you need anything, call me." Julia smiled, but inside she felt empty. San Francisco welcomed her with its bustling energy and foggy, steep streets. Julia rented a tiny room above a laundromat. The peeling walls, the creaky bed that groaned every time she turned, and the constant hum of washing machines mixed with the smell of soap day and night. But to Julia, that room was a new world. No more looks of contempt, no more suffocating silence, just freedom and responsibility for herself. To make ends meet, Julia worked part-time at a small Italian café on the corner. Mornings she went to class, afternoons she worked her shift, and nights she hunched over her desk under a dim yellow lamp. The work was hard. Her hands were always rough from washing dishes, and her feet ached from standing for hours. But this kind of tiredness was nothing like the exhaustion she felt back at her old home. This was the tiredness she chose, the kind that bought her freedom and belief in herself. On rainy days, Julia often sat by the cafe window, watching the hurried crowds outside. The clanging of streetcars and the patter of rain on the pavement gave her a strange but exciting feeling. In San Francisco, no one knew she was Thomas Bennett's daughter. No one cared about Evelyn, and no one mentioned Chloe or Ryan. Here, she was just Julia, a student, a waitress, a young woman trying to write her own story. The father-daughter bond gradually grew distant. Calls from her father became rare and brief, usually when Evelyn was away, and he would ask a few questions. "Are you okay? How's school? Do you have enough to eat?" His voice was steady but carried the guilt Julia could hear in every word. But those calls always ended quickly, never lasting more than a few minutes. Julia hung up, her heart filled with a mix of warmth and sadness. Dad still cared, but the distance between them was too wide to bridge. One night, late, Julia sat studying in a cold room. She turned on the answering machine, and when she played it back, there was a message from her dad. He said briefly, "I'm sorry for not being there for you more, but I'm always proud of you." Julia burst into tears, clutching her pillow tightly. Those words were like a small light in the darkness, but they also reminded her there was an invisible wall between them, built from years of silence and wrong choices. The college years flew by quickly. Julia studied, worked part-time, and struggled to survive in an expensive city. But those hardships helped her grow up. She learned to budget every penny for meals, to heal herself when sick with no one around, and to get back up after every failure. Whenever she was tired, she'd open a jar of lavender and take a deep breath of its gentle scent to remember her mom was still with her, at least in memory and in her heart. After 4 years, Julia graduated. Her friends chose office jobs at big companies, but she decided to follow her passion connected to coffee shops. From part-time shifts at an Italian cafe, she grew to love the smell of roasted coffee, the sound of the espresso machine, and the feeling of handing a hot cup to a smiling customer. With her small savings and a little loan, Julia opened her first cafe in Denver. It was a small place, with just 10 mismatched tables and chairs, a handwritten menu on a blackboard, and pots of purple lavender in every corner. She named the cafe Lavender Bloom. It was Julia's way of holding on to a part of her mom, a reminder that, out of loss, new strength can bloom. The cafe wasn't busy right away. Some days only a few people stopped by, but Julia stayed persistent. Gradually, regular customers appeared, and word spread. The cafe became a small but cozy meeting spot in the big city. During those years, Julia didn't keep in much contact with her dad. The physical and emotional distance slowly made their calls less frequent. Every time she remembers, her heart aches, but she's also learning to accept it. Her father chose a different path, a different family. As for her, through effort and determination, she wrote her own new life. Looking back, Julia knows that leaving home at 18 was a crucial turning point. It cut the chains that held her back and opened a journey full of challenges, but also freedom. And that journey built the resilience she needed to face an even bigger crisis ahead, a crisis that would pull her back into the past, face her stepmother, the will, and a truth she never expected. After graduating, Julia didn't follow the typical office career path like many of her friends. She didn't choose big companies with steady paychecks. Instead, she put all her savings, plus a small loan, into opening a small cafe in Denver. She named it Lavender Bloom. The name was a tribute to her mother, the woman who planted in her childhood a love for those purple lavender sprigs. Lavender Bloom wasn't fancy, just 10 old tables and chairs she bought from thrift stores. On each table, Julia placed a small pot of lavender, letting its gentle scent fill the space. The walls were decorated with countryside photos she took on her trips. The menu was handwritten in white chalk on a blackboard behind the counter, featuring simple dishes she learned while working part-time at an Italian cafe in San Francisco. The first few months were really tough. Some days only a few customers stopped by, drank their coffee, and left. Many times Julia stood behind the counter, forcing herself to smile despite worrying about rent, ingredients, and piling bills. But she didn't give up. Little by little, regulars started to show up. A young writer often chose a quiet corner to work on manuscripts. An elderly couple held hands and came for tea every Saturday afternoon. A group of nurses from a nearby clinic often stopped by after their shifts. It was patience and the warm atmosphere that slowly made the café a gathering spot for many. Julia feels happy seeing Lavender Bloom slowly come back to life, a proof that she can build something with her own hands. Every morning, when she opens the cafe door and the scent of coffee and lavender blends, she thinks of her mother and whispers, "I did it." Meanwhile, Thomas Bennett is becoming increasingly wealthy. The construction company he founded in his youth has grown tremendously. He expanded into several states, signed major contracts, and Bennett Construction became one of the most notable corporations in the Western region. His assets reached $154 million, including the company, real estate, investment accounts, and many other valuable properties. In the media, Thomas was praised as a successful businessman, a symbol of the American dream. But in Julia's heart, he was just a distant name. She hadn't been in contact with her father for many years. Only occasionally, he would make a rushed call during holidays, ask a few questions, then hang up quickly. Their father-daughter relationship grew thinner, like a fragile thread that could snap with the slightest breeze. One winter morning, while Julia was arranging pastries in the glass case at Lavender Bloom, her phone rang. On the other end was a strange male voice. "Excuse me, are you Julia Bennett? I'm Thomas Bennett's personal assistant. I'm calling to inform you that your father has just been hospitalized due to a heart condition. The situation is serious. You should come immediately." Julia froze. Each word hit her heart like a thunderclap, leaving her stunned. It had been years since she last saw her father, but hearing this news filled her body with worry. She hurriedly locked the cafe and booked the earliest flight to Portland. Throughout the trip, her mind was in a whirl. Images of her father and memories appeared, sometimes strong in an old flannel shirt, sometimes distant at fancy parties with Evelyn. Now, he lay somewhere between life and death, and she didn't know what she would face. The hospital was bright with white lights, the sharp smell of disinfectant thick in the air. Julia's footsteps echoed down the long hallway, her heart racing. When she reached the hospital room door, she saw Evelyn standing there. The woman was as perfect as ever, her hair neatly tied up, wearing an expensive dress, with a cold smile. Seeing Julia, Evelyn curled her lips. "Finally showing up, but I don't think you need to bother. He already has his own family. Your presence only messes things up." Julia didn't reply, just brushed past her to enter the room. Thomas lay in the hospital bed, weak and pale. Medical tubes and the steady beep of the heart monitor surrounded him. But when he saw Julia, his eyes lit up. "Julia," he whispered weakly. She stepped forward, tightly holding her father's hand. His hand was cold, but the grip still had some strength. In that moment, all distance and resentment seemed to vanish. Tears welled up as Julia choked out, "I'm here, Dad. I've come." Thomas smiled, his lips trembling. "I'm sorry, Julia. I've let you suffer so much. I can't change the past, but trust me, I've prepared for you," Julia asked shakily. "Prepared for what, Dad? What do you mean?" But he just shook his head, his eyes closing, breath growing weak. "Trust me," he whispered. Behind the door, Julia still felt Evelyn's cold gaze. The woman stood with crossed arms, a mocking smile flickering at the corner of her lips, as if waiting for the moment Thomas would leave this world to take everything over. Inside Julia, a storm of emotions rose. A fragile hope from her father's words, fear of the imminent loss, and anger at Evelyn's venomous smile. She knew a new chapter in her life was beginning, one that would bring conflicts far more fierce than anything she had faced before. 2 weeks after their hospital meeting, Thomas Bennett passed away. His death came on a gray, rainy morning, as Portland was covered in thick fog. Julia received the news through a brief call from his assistant. No words of comfort, no other details, just the simple announcement. "Mr. Bennett passed away this morning. The funeral will be held on Saturday." Julia sat frozen in her cafe, still holding her hot coffee, but her body felt icy cold. She had braced herself for this day, but when it actually arrived, her heart felt like it was being crushed. On the day of the funeral, the Portland sky was gloomy. Heavy clouds blocked the sun, Wind howled through the bare maple trees. The Bennett family cemetery sat atop a high hill overlooking the river winding through the city. The front row seats around the flower-covered coffin were where Evelyn and her 2 children, Chloe and Ryan, sat dignified in elegant funeral attire. Evelyn wore a long black cloak, a silk scarf wrapped around her neck, and a wide-brimmed hat partially shading her face. She stood in the center, where all eyes were fixed. Julia did not sit nearby. She stood further away, under the old maple tree's shade, where shadows hid her tear-streaked face. She wore an old coat, her hair simply tied back. To many, she looked more like a stranger than the daughter of the deceased. Most attendees were business partners, friends of Evelyn, and social connections from the upper class. They came, exchanged polite hugs with Evelyn, offered condolences, then walked away. Hardly anyone paid attention to Julia. The priest read the farewell words, his steady voice echoing in the cold air. The coffin was lowered, white roses were tossed down with it. Julia clenched her hands tightly, tears streaming down her face. She looked down at where her father lay, feeling as if a part of her soul was leaving her. In her memories, he was still the father who held her hand through stormy days, who carried her on his shoulders at summer fairs, whispering, "You are everything to me." Now, all that remained was an endless void. As the ceremony ended, guests began to leave. Julia remained standing still, unwilling to leave that place. She wanted to say goodbye alone. But before she could step closer to the coffin, Evelyn approached. The sound of her high heels clicked on the gravel, stopping right in front of Julia. Evelyn bowed her head slightly, her lips curling into a half-smile. She whispered, her voice cold as steel, "Don't be delusional. You won't get anything." Julia froze. In the darkest moment of mourning, Evelyn still didn't miss a chance to crush her. Those words echoed, sharp like thousands of needles piercing straight into her heart. Julia didn't respond. She knew any reaction would only satisfy Evelyn more. Instead, she turned away and walked toward her father's grave. The freshly covered grave still had damp soil, the scent of fresh grass and cold earth filling the air. Julia knelt down, her trembling hand resting on the stone, engraved with Thomas Bennett's name. Tears streamed down, falling onto the damp ground. She choked out a whisper. "I don't need money. I don't need the inheritance. I just wish I had more time with you, Dad. I just want you to stay." In that moment, her father's voice echoed in her memory. Weak but clear, as if it were just yesterday. "Trust me, I've prepared for you." That short sentence suddenly became her only lifeline. Julia clung to it tightly, like a traveler holding onto a lamp during a stormy night. She sat by the grave for a long time, despite the biting wind and the cemetery growing quiet. Memories of her father flooded back, from pancake breakfasts to the brief calls toward the end. Each memory intertwined love and loss. She knew her father had made many mistakes, had let Evelyn dominate, and had let his daughter suffer a lot. But Julia also knew he loved her in his own way, a love Evelyn could never erase. When she finally stood up, Julia's face was wet with tears, but her eyes were brighter. She recalled that last wish and whispered, "I trust you, Dad." In the distance, Evelyn, Chloe, and Ryan got into a luxury car, leaving the cemetery. The image of Evelyn sitting in the back seat, her face full of arrogance, was deeply etched in Julia's mind. But instead of feeling afraid, for the first time, Julia felt a small flame ignite inside her. She could laugh, sneer, or believe she had won it all. But Julia knew the truth was still waiting ahead. And whatever that truth was, it wouldn't let Evelyn have full control. That morning, Portland was shrouded in thick fog. Julia wore the simplest black dress she had, worn high heels, and put on a thin coat to fight the biting cold. She stood in front of the red brick building that housed Lawyer Howard's office. The old building still held an air of dignity, with frosted glass windows reflecting passers-by. Julia took a deep breath before pushing the door open. Inside, the hallway gleamed under yellow lights, the scent of polished wood and old papers blending in the air. She followed the receptionist's directions to a large room at the end of the hall. Her heart pounded as her hand touched the door handle. Inside, everyone was already seated. Evelyn took the center seat at the long wooden table, sitting upright, her face cold, but lips pressed tight as if holding back a triumphant smile. Next to her were Chloe and Ryan, both dressed neatly. Chloe sat with her legs crossed, her eyes glancing at Julia with disdain. Ryan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face showing clear arrogance. Julia chose the chair farthest away, near the corner of the room. She sat quietly, feeling like an outsider, even though she was the biological daughter of the man being discussed. The atmosphere was thick. Evelyn looked at Julia with a victorious gaze, then turned to lawyer Howard with a commanding tone. "Shall we begin?" The side door opened, and Howard entered. He was a man in his 60s, sturdy build, neatly graying hair, kind but sharp eyes. He placed his briefcase on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat at the head of the table. The room fell so silent Julia could clearly hear the sound of paper flipping. "We are gathered here today to read the will of Mr. Thomas Bennett," Howard began, his voice steady and slow. "According to the rules, I will read the entire document, and I ask everyone to remain silent until the announcement is finished." Julia sat up straight, clasping her hands tightly to hide her trembling. Evelyn leaned back, her eyes shining as a proud smile spread across her face. Chloe and Ryan exchanged glances, as if expecting an obvious victory. Howard began reading. "I, Thomas Bennett, of sound mind and will, hereby make this will to divide all my assets." He paused briefly, scanning the room before continuing. "I bequeath all my assets, including real estate, company shares, investment accounts, and related items, to my wife Evelyn Bennett and our children, Chloe Bennett and Ryan Bennett." The room fell silent. Evelyn pressed her lips into a perfect curve, a satisfied smile blooming like a poisonous flower. Chloe leaned back in her chair, her eyes full of triumph directed at Julia. Ryan nodded slightly, a cocky smile tugging at his mouth. Julia sat motionless. Each word hit her like a hammer blow. The entire estate, all of it, not a single word for her, the firstborn daughter, the one their father had promised, was everything to him. In that moment, Julia felt erased, wiped clean from the inheritance, from the family history itself. Her throat tightened. Her heart shattered into pieces. All those fragile days of hope that her father had prepared for her, that the phrase "trust Dad" would mean something, seemed to vanish. Evelyn looked straight at Julia, her eyes flashing with triumph. She slowly tilted her head, as if wanting to etch this image into her rival's mind. Julia bit her lip hard, trying not to let tears fall. She knew if she cried now, Evelyn would only feel more satisfied. But inside, she felt utterly betrayed. The promise by the sickbed, the faint whisper, "Dad prepared for you," now felt like a cruel joke. Howard continued reading, his voice steady in the heavy room. "The remainder of the estate will be divided according to the attached terms." He paused, his eyes briefly flickering to Julia, and at that moment, a slight mysterious smile appeared on his lips. Evelyn suddenly frowned. Her smile faltered for a fleeting moment. Chloe whispered something to Ryan. Despite her chaotic heart, Julia caught the small detail. Howard's faint smile was no accident. It was like a sign that something was hidden in that file. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Evelyn's confidence was still there, but underneath was a flicker of confusion. Julia took a deep breath and sat quietly, waiting. A faint glimmer of hope stirred inside her. Maybe this will wasn't as simple as Evelyn thought. Maybe their father's final promise still held value. Howard closed the file, looking up at everyone. "This is the official part of the will, filed according to legal procedures," he said. "However," he paused, his eyes resting on Julia before shifting to Evelyn, "there are still some things that need to be clarified." The whole room fell silent. Evelyn gripped the armrest tightly, her eyes flashing with doubt. Julia sat up straight, her heart pounding. She knew the next moment could change everything. The room sank into a heavy silence after Lawyer Howard stopped reading the will. Evelyn leaned back, trying to regain her composure, but the earlier triumphant smile had vanished. Chloe frowned, while Ryan grew restless, tapping his foot rapidly. Julia sat still, her heart racing, waiting for what Howard had just hinted at. He opened his briefcase and took out a second thick file. He placed it neatly on the table, removed his glasses to clean them, then spoke slowly. "Besides the will I just read, Thomas Bennett left another document, created 3 years ago. This document isn't part of the usual inheritance process, because it's an irrevocable trust." Evelyn raised her eyebrows, her face paling slightly. "Irrevocable trust? What did you say?" she growled. Howard nodded gently. "That's right. An irrevocable trust, legally established and completed 3 years ago. All the main assets, including Bennett Construction Company shares, properties in Portland and Denver, the Cannon Beach vacation home, a Montana farm, a yacht, and the entire investment portfolio have been transferred into this trust. The sole beneficiary is Julia Bennett. The room erupted. Ryan jumped up, slamming his hand on the table. "No way! This is a trick! My father would never do this!" Chloe gasped, her face flushing as she whispered, "All of it? Everything? The whole company?" Evelyn leaned forward, eyes wide with shock. "Number, there has to be a mistake. Thomas would never leave me and the kids with nothing. Never." Howard remained calm, his voice steady but firm. "I understand this is a shock, but everything has been verified, signed, and legally notarized. This is Thomas Bennett's signature, undeniable." He pushed the thick file toward them. "All valuable assets belong to Julia Bennett. According to the will, Mrs. Evelyn and the 2 children will receive the old cabin in Montana, plus a 2001 truck that needs repairs." Evelyn slammed her hand on the table. "Number, this is an insult. He owes me. I took care of him for years. I'm the legal wife, his partner. How could he leave everything to that useless girl?" She pointed angrily at Julia, shouting with rage. Chloe started crying. "Mom, say something. This isn't fair. Ryan and I are his children too." Ryan screamed, threatening, "I'll sue. I'll take this to court. No one can take away what belongs to us." The room erupted in chaos. The sound of chairs scraping, shouting, and crying blended together. Julia sat still, her whole body stunned. Her ears rang, heart pounding wildly. She couldn't believe what she'd just heard. The entire fortune, the whole company, her father's legacy, all belonged to her. This was something she never dared to imagine. Howard looked at Julia, his eyes kind. "He believed only you could protect the legacy he built with his whole life. He told me Julia understands the value of hard work, the sacrifices, and won't let the company or assets become a power game." Julia lifted her head, eyes wet with tears. "But I don't know what to do with all of this. I never thought I'd have it." Her voice trembled, choked with emotion. Howard nodded softly. "Thomas knew you'd say that. But he also knew you have the strength to handle it. He prepared an advisory board, loyal people within the company who will support you. He just wants you to lead with your integrity, not let others take advantage." Evelyn nearly lost control. She lunged at Howard, grabbing the file folder. "I won't accept this. I won't let that girl take everything. We'll sue. We'll drag the whole court into this." Howard held the folder tightly, his voice calm. "You're welcome to try, but this trust was legally established and can't be undone. All the documents are clear. You'll have to work hard, but the outcome won't change." Evelyn was panting, then turned to Julia, her eyes full of hatred. "You think you've won? Don't bet on it. I'll make you pay for daring to take everything." Julia stared right into her eyes, not looking away for the first time. A strange strength welled up inside her. "I didn't take anything. This was my father's decision. He chose, and I respect that." Her voice wasn't loud, but clear and firm, making the whole room pause for a moment. Chloe sobbed, while Ryan stomped angrily, cursing Julia with harsh words. Evelyn pulled her 2 children close, then stood up abruptly. "Let's go. This farce isn't over yet." With that, she and her kids left the room, their heels echoing sharply like knives slicing through the air. The large room suddenly fell into an unusual silence. Julia sat quietly, her hand resting on the file Howard had just pushed toward her. The weight felt like the whole world was pressing down on her shoulders, both dizzying and frightening. But deep inside, a small flame flickered to life. She remembered her father's words in the hospital. "Trust me, I've prepared you." Howard smiled softly, his tone gentle. "He trusted you completely, Julia. Now, you're the one who holds that legacy, and I believe you can do it." Julia took a deep breath and wiped away her tears. She knew the road ahead would be full of challenges. Evelyn wouldn't give up, and the threats would surely continue. But now, she understood the meaning behind her father's last wishes. He gave her not just the assets, but responsibility, and the belief that she was strong enough to stand firm. The lawyer's office door slammed shut, leaving behind the hurried footsteps and angry heel clicks of Evelyn and her 2 children. The atmosphere inside the room gradually calmed, leaving only Julia's heavy sighs and pounding heart. Everything happened so fast that she still couldn't believe she had become the sole heir to her father's entire estate. Evelyn stormed off in anger, and from that moment on, the family that once existed in name only fell apart. The full Christmas dinner Julia once dreamed of never came true. Instead, there was only division, resentment, and hatred. In the days that followed, the city's press quickly reported on the shocking inheritance dispute. Several major newspapers headlined, 150, $4 million inheritance falls entirely to eldest daughter Julia Bennett. Her name appeared in the headlines, sparking countless rumors and curious glances from everyone around her. Julia had never been used to that kind of attention. She was just a small cafe owner, living quietly in the streets of Denver. Yet now, all eyes were on her, some admiring, some skeptical, and even jealous. As for Evelyn, after her defeat, she kept appearing in the media, accusing Julia of being greedy and stealing the rights of a lawful wife and children. That hatred was like a storm, growing stronger and threatening to sweep away the peace Julia once had. But deep down, Julia knew one thing. She could not back down. That inheritance was not just money, it was the lifetime of hard work, sweat, and tears of her father. He had started from nothing, building a construction company in Austin, which gradually grew into a reputable corporation. Julia understood clearly that if Evelyn took control, everything her father built would soon become a tool for vanity. On her first day stepping into the Bennett Construction headquarters, Julia felt the heavy weight of responsibility. Employees in sharp suits looked at her with a mix of surprise and scrutiny. They were used to seeing Evelyn as the boss, but now it was Julia, a simple young woman, stepping up to take over. Julia's heart tightened, but she remembered her father's whisper in the hospital, "Trust me. Trust yourself." Howard and some longtime managers stood beside her, reassuring her that they would fully support her. Julia began learning how to read financial reports, attending board meetings, and getting used to this high-pressure world. Many nights, she stayed late in the office, staring at piles of documents, feeling lost in a maze. But whenever she felt tired, she would open her wallet and look at an old photo of her parents. In the photo, her mother smiled brightly among lavender fields, while her father stood beside her, his hand resting on little Julia's shoulder. Those memories helped her stay strong. Julia understood she couldn't let fear swallow her whole. She had to keep moving forward because her father had placed his complete trust in her. However, she never abandoned Lavender Bloom, the small cafe that had been with her for years. Julia kept the habit of stopping by every morning to personally prepare a few cappuccinos for regular customers. That cafe wasn't just a business, it was where her mother's spirit lived on. The scent of dried lavender on the shelves and the soft guitar tunes filling the air reminded Julia of peaceful evenings when her mother was still alive. Some nights, Julia sat alone in the cafe after dark, watching the streetlights reflect through the glass windows. She wondered if she was strong enough to carry it all, but then in that quiet moment, she heard her father's words echo in her heart, "Believe in yourself." And she knew, no matter how tough the road ahead, she would keep going, because it wasn't just a responsibility, it was the only way to keep her promise to him. Still, the consequences of this decision weighed heavily on Julia. Evelyn kept trying to cause trouble, hiring lawyers to sue, even spreading false rumors in the press. Chloe fell into a crisis, and Ryan drowned his anger in alcohol. The family completely fell apart, losing all sense of connection. And Julia, once on the sidelines, suddenly became the center of it all, both the winner and the one bearing all the pressure. Every morning, Julia put on her coat and stepped outside, telling herself she had to be strong. Because now, she wasn't just living for herself. She carried on the legacy, efforts, and soul of her parents on her shoulders. And through all the storms, Lavender Bloom Cafe remained the only place she could return to, taking a deep breath of the lingering lavender scent, reminding herself that a part of her peace still remained. The first months running Bennett Construction were a huge challenge. Julia had no management background, no construction industry experience, and no one to guide her except initial support from lawyer Howard. At every meeting, she faced suspicious looks, and some even openly questioned, can a cafe owner really have what it takes to lead a multi-million-dollar corporation? At first, Julia quietly endured it. She didn't respond, just focused on observing and taking notes on every detail. During the day, she sat in the conference room. At night, she buried herself in thick piles of documents, reading until dawn. She taught herself how to read blueprints, understand financial reports, and handle construction contracts. Whenever she felt tired, Julia thought of her father, of his calloused hands that had wielded a hammer to build their first home from scratch. If Dad could start from zero, then so can I. Gradually, some longtime employees who had worked closely with Thomas began to change their views. They realized Julia wasn't just an inherited child, but someone truly trying to learn and listen. Raymond, a manager in his 52nd who had followed her father from the early days, one afternoon came to Julia, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "You remind me of Mr. Thomas. He used to work just like that, never afraid to get his hands dirty or to learn." Those words moved Julia to tears but also gave her strength. One day, while cleaning her father's old office, Julia accidentally opened a drawer under the desk. Inside was a yellowed envelope. On it was hastily written a few familiar words, "For Julia." Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a short letter. "My dear daughter, I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to tell you these things while I was alive. So many times, I stayed silent, making you feel lost. I know I hurt you by letting Evelyn into our home and changing everything, but you must believe not a single day went by that I didn't think of you. Dad spent his whole life building this company, but he understood clearly that money means nothing if it's not given to the right person. You are my only hope. You're a strong child with a kind heart, and that's what matters most. Live true and live strong. Don't be afraid. I'm always with you, in every brick we've laid, in every breath you take. Love you, Dad." Julia burst into tears. She let the tears fall onto the page, smudging a few lines, but inside, for the first time in years, she felt at peace. All the doubts and childhood wounds seemed to fade as she read the last lines. "You are my only hope." From that moment, Julia knew she no longer had to prove anything to Evelyn, nor worry about what others thought. She just needed to live and work worthy of the trust her father had placed in her. In the years that followed, Julia gradually established her position. She introduced new policies to the company, focusing on workers' welfare, ensuring workplace safety, and encouraging creativity in design. Bennett Construction transformed from a dry building corporation into a symbol of humanity and social responsibility. The press began calling Julia the compassionate heir, a complete contrast to the once greedy and cold Evelyn. Despite being busy, Julia never forgot Lavender Bloom. That little café still opened every day, still serving lattes and cappuccinos rich with lavender aroma. Julia often stopped by on weekends, sitting in her usual corner, watching people go by. To her, Lavender Bloom was a bridge between past and present, where her mother's presence lingered in every dried flower, where her father once sat listening to his daughter's school stories. Regular customers gradually learned that the owner was now a successful businesswoman, but to them, Julia remained the gentle girl with eyes that always shone warmly. Sometimes, strangers would come just to sit in that space, saying they could feel a rare kind of peace there. Julia smiled every time she looked around the café, clearly feeling she had found balance. On one side was the giant corporation, demanding reason, discipline, and strength. On the other side was the small café, holding on to memories and love. Both blended together to create a new Julia, strong yet compassionate. And above all, her father's letter still lay in the desk drawer, right beneath the glass on the tabletop. Every morning when starting a new day, Julia would place her hand there as a silent greeting. "Dad, I will carry on. I won't let you down." In Julia's heart, the storm had passed. Now, she was no longer the girl ridiculed and looked down upon in her own home. She had grown into a strong woman, brave enough to face her fate, and most importantly, she had found peace within herself. Julia Bennett's story didn't just end with a will or family disputes. It was the journey of a daughter, once abandoned and underestimated, who ultimately found recognition through her father's faith. This wasn't just a victory over property, but a triumph of trust, patience, and integrity. The first lesson we can clearly see is that family ties can be broken, but true love never disappears. Julia's father, though distant at times and making her feel lonely, quietly prepared a safe future for her. He didn't say much, didn't make grand promises, but his silent act of leaving his entire legacy to his daughter was proof of deep love. The second lesson is that silent strength will eventually be recognized. Julia was mocked by her stepmother, heard harsh words that she was just a shadow of the past. Yet, instead of giving up, she chose to patiently build an independent life. She studied, worked hard, and opened the Lavender Bloom Café to preserve her mother's memory. It was that strength that earned her father's full trust, leaving all his assets to Julia. The story also affirms the truth that money isn't as important as trust and integrity. Evelyn may have used tricks to manipulate, may have been the center at the funeral, but in the end, all she got was an old cabin and a broken-down car. Because material wealth can be lost, but trust and love cannot be taken away by anyone. A small but meaningful detail is that Julia still kept her little café. Even though she is now the heir to a huge fortune, she never gave up the place tied to her mother's memories and love. This shows that every success, every legacy, without roots in love and memory, is just meaningless numbers. The audience can see themselves in this story. Maybe you've also been abandoned, felt lost within your own family. Maybe you once thought justice would never come. But Julia's story proves that justice may come late, but it will come. As long as you stay determined, honest, and true to yourself, the light at the end will guide your way. One important choice Julia made is something many people reflect on. That choice was forgiveness, or walking away. When Evelyn got angry, threatened, and insulted her, Julia didn't respond with bitterness. She chose to walk away, to build a new future, using her father's legacy to create value and justice for others. It wasn't revenge, but a victory of perseverance. The question for all of us is, if we were in Julia's situation, what would we do? Would we choose forgiveness or walk away? Would we believe that justice will come, even if it's late? The Crying Inside channel wants to send you a message that family is not only defined by blood, but also by love, trust, and protection. Without those things, you have every right to create a new family for yourself, through friendship, community, and those who truly cherish you. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been rejected by your own family? If that happened, would you choose forgiveness or walk away? Do you believe justice will eventually come, even if it's late? Please share your thoughts in the comments, because your story might inspire someone else, just like Julia's journey has touched our hearts today. Thank you all for patiently following the whole story today on the Crying Inside channel. Each episode we bring you is not just a family story, but a journey of emotions, tears, faith, and strength. If Julia Bennett's story touched your heart, please let us know by leaving a comment below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next videos. Every like, share, and subscription from you is the biggest motivation for us to keep bringing heartfelt and meaningful stories. We believe that everyone has a story they want to tell. Maybe you've experienced loss, betrayal, or moments when you thought you couldn't get back up. But what matters isn't how you fell, it's how you chose to rise. To end today's video, we want to leave you with a message. Family can bring you down, but it can also be your greatest source of strength. What's important is how you choose to stand back up. Thank you once again for joining Crying Inside. See you in the next stories.